Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything. Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Again, this is the second textbook, and this one is from the year 1940. An American history textbook. An American history textbook from a Catholic school. New England Colonies, Chapter 3, Section 4. The New England Colonies. Religious disorder in England. There was much religious disorder in England during the time America was being settled. The people who had left the Catholic Church became Protestants. The people who left the Catholic Church denied two important beliefs. 1. They denied the authority of the Pope. 2. They denied the authority in spiritual matters. What? They denied the Catholic Church was the supreme or highest authority in spiritual matters. That is, before long, these Protestants began to disagree among themselves. There were many things which did not faze the Protestants. They were unhappy. They missed the spiritual peace of the Catholic religion. 1940, Catholic school book. The Protestant Church in England was called the Church of England. The king was made the head of the Church of England. The Church of England would have nothing further to do with the Pope. Its members denied the authority of the Vicar of Christ, as the Pope is often called. The Puritans. There were some members of the Church of England who were not satisfied with the new form of worship. Now, these people had some very dedicated notions. 1. They disliked most ceremonies. 2. They wished a very simple form of worship. 3. They believed in very strict rules of conduct. These Protestants said that by getting far from the Catholic Church, they would make their religion more pure. That is why they came to be called Puritans. The Pilgrims, who I thought were the Puritans, but the Pilgrims, there were some Protestants of England who desired even greater changes from their worship. They were not willing to belong to the Church of England. They wanted to make up a form of worship to please themselves. A law was passed commanding all people to attend Church of England. Many Protestants would not obey the law. They separated themselves from the Church of England. That is why they were called separatists or independents. The separatists were in a very bad fix. The law forbade them to have their own form of religion while they lived in England. There seemed only one way out of the difficulty. They left England and went to Holland in search of religious freedom. Persons who had to go on a religious journey are often called pilgrims. So the English Protestants who had journeyed to Holland were called pilgrims. New heading. The Pilgrims. How the Pilgrims lived in Holland. The people of Holland were very kind to the Pilgrims, yet the Pilgrims were not happy. They were troubled about many things. The Pilgrims did not feel at home in Holland. They longed for a native land, for their native land, England. It's not easy to change their manner of living. England and Holland are different in so many ways. The language was strange, and so were the customs of the people. Customs are the ways and manners of things. The customs of Hollanders were quite different from those of English in many ways. Why are they repeating themselves? The picture shows some pilgrims in Holland. Here's the picture. And there's a windmill. I went to the windmills in the Netherlands, and they are big and made of stone. Well, the gears are made of stone, as I recall. The Pilgrims had a very serious worry. They began to be afraid that their children would grow up just like little boys and girls of Holland. The Pilgrims wished their children to keep the language and customs of England. Pilgrim leaders began to dream of going to America. This seemed a good plan. Preparing to go to America. Permission had to be obtained from the King of England before the Pilgrims could go to America. The king was very slow in granting his permission. At last, he gave his consent. Most of the Pilgrims were poor folk. They were badly in need of money. They were able to borrow enough money to buy supplies and ships. The Pilgrims were brave folk. It took great courage to start for America with their families. These people were earnest. They were willing to face many hardships. They only desired to reach a place where they could practice their own religion. They knew that in America they would be free to worship as they believed they should. Leaving Holland, the Pilgrims left Holland in a little ship called the Speedwell. This was not a good name for a boat that was very slow moving. At last, the Speedwell reached the port of Southampton in England. The Mayflower. The Speedwell was joined by another ship called the Mayflower. The two ships set sail from England in the journey to America. Before the Speedwell had sailed very far, the captain decided that the vessel was unsafe. He ordered the Speedwell to return to port. Some of the passengers of the Speedwell were transferred to the Mayflower. The sturdy little Mayflower spread its sails and set off for America. The voyage. It was a very stormy voyage. The Mayflower was tossed about the waves. The great waves battered against the vessel. The vessel was damaged. One of the Pilgrims had a large bolt among his possessions. The damage to the vessel was repaired by using the bolt to hold the broken pieces together. It took the Mayflower 63 days to reach America. Fast steamers now cross the Atlantic between England and America in 4 or 5 days. Fast steamers now, meaning in 1940, when this book was written. The Mayflower Compact. The Pilgrims held a meeting before they landed. All the Pilgrims signed an agreement. An agreement is something called a compact. I didn't know that. The agreement signed by the Pilgrims was called the Mayflower Compact. Under the terms of the Mayflower Compact, all of the Pilgrims promised to obey the laws. They also promised to work for the good of the colony. John Carver was elected governor of the colony. Miles Standish was made the military leader. The Pilgrims felt that Miles Standish would be a strong leader, although not a Pilgrim. The landing. The Mayflower first dropped its anchor where the shores were rocky and barren. Where land is barren, no crops can be grown. This was not a good place for settlement. John Carver and Miles Standish, with a few of the men, set out in a small boat. They explored along the shore. They searched for a safe place to begin settlement. Plymouth Rock. The little exploring party had many exciting adventures. They had one unpleasant experience with unfriendly Indians. At last, they reached a fine little harbor. They returned to the Mayflower to make their report. Then they led the Mayflower into the harbor, which they called Plymouth. Here the Pilgrims landed on December 10th, 1620. They knelt and thanked God for the safe landing. They were indeed grateful for a safe landing after a long sea voyage. I wonder what the unfriendly experience was with the Indians. All they said was they had an unpleasant experience. The first days in America. It is very, very cold. It was very cold when the Pilgrims landed. The weather was ever so much colder than winter weather in England or in Holland. The bad weather at sea and the cold weather after they landed and the poor food caused much sickness. Those who were able to begin work, who were able began to work. First, they decided to build a fort. A fort is any strong building. A fort is any strong building or enclosed place that can be used as defense against an enemy. It was wise to build a fort because of the Indians. Captain Miles Standish decided that the fort should be built on top of a hill, as shown in the picture. This fort was strong but simply made. A space was enclosed by logs. A platform was built. The men placed several cannons on the platform. Cannons are big guns mounted on a frame. The Pilgrims had brought the cannons from England. They felt safe once the fort was made and the cannons were in place. They had began to build houses to serve as shelter. Look at their little illustration here. You can see. In the illustration, you'll see little homes. And then you'll see over here, on top of the small hill, a little barracks. Or what do you call it? Fort. The first house. After building a large log cabin, it had a roof of thatch. First building was a large log cabin. It had a roof of thatch. Some of the settlers moved into this house. The other settlers decided to remain on the Mayflower. One day, a sad thing happened. A spark from the fire blew onto the roof. The thatch caught fire and the house burned to the ground. Very little work could be done while the winter lasted. The snow was very deep and the cold was very bitter. This was very hard on the Pilgrims, who were used to mild winters. Many of the Pilgrims who were sick died. 51 persons died during that first winter. Even the Pilgrims of Governor Carver. Even the death of Governor Carver did not discourage the Pilgrims. Later, the Pilgrims were able to build a sawmill. Then they built better homes. Chests of drawers and cabinets were also made at a later date. The large room in the log cabin was used not only as a living room, but also a kitchen and as a workshop. All the meals were cooked in the open fireplace. Logs were used as fuel. The kettles, pots, dippers, pans, and large ladles were hung near the fireplace. Dried apples, ears of corn, smoked hams, and sides of bacon were hung from large timbers, which supported the roof. In living room was indeed a great workshop. This living room was indeed a great workshop. Here candles were made. Tallow was melted over the fire. Wicks were dipped into melted tallow. Sometimes the melted tallow was poured into wooden molds. This process made better candles. The women and girls had their spinning wheels in this room. Here they spun flax fiber to make linen thread, or they spun wool to make woolen yarn. The loom stood in its corner of the room. Cloth was woven in the loom. Boots, shoes, and harness were made by the men. Brooms were made by tying twigs into bundles. The women and girls knitted scarves and mittens. Games, too, were played in this room. The living room was indeed a most useful and pleasant place. The new town. It is slow work building a little town, as shown in the picture on page 95, the one that I showed you. Even when it was finished, it was not very pleasant-looking town. There was only one street. It ran from shore to the top of the hill where the fort had been built. The street was not paved. At first, there was no sidewalk or street lights. It was most like a path than a street, more like a path than a street. The first Thanksgiving. Conditions in the little settlement were very good by the end of the summer. The Pilgrims had raised good crops of corn. There was plenty of game, and fish had been salted and stored for the coming winter. The Pilgrims were a religious people. They were ready to forget their sufferings. They were already counting their blessings. The Pilgrims decided to spend some time in Thanksgiving. They decided to have a feast. They invited their Indian friends to help them celebrate. The Thanksgiving lasted 3 days. Captain Miles Standish led the little army on a parade. They had a drill. Games were played, and after that came the feast. 4 hunters had been sent into the forest to kill wild turkeys and other game. The Indians' guests brought 5 deer, cornbread, and baked for the feast. Cornbread was baked for the feast. Cranberries were cooked. Plenty of nuts were gathered. There was a supply of cooked vegetables and a little fruit. It was indeed a great feast. The Pilgrims and the Indians were better friends at the end of the 3 days of Thanksgiving. A good example. The Pilgrims set 2 very good examples. 1, their plan of a Thanksgiving at the end of their harvest season has been followed by our nation. Each year, our president orders the people to set aside a day in Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving Day usually is the last Thursday in November. Again, this book was written in 1940. 2, the great courage of the Pilgrims was their second good example. The Puritans decided to follow the example of the Pilgrims to establish settlement in America. The Puritans come to America. Why the Puritans left England? The Protestants in England were having a great deal of trouble. The king looked upon the Puritans as enemies. He had 2 reasons for considering the Puritans to be his enemies. 1, the Puritans disagreed with the Church of England on matters of form of worship. The king was the head of the Church of England. 2, the Puritans disagreed with the king on questions of government. The Puritans realized that to remain in England meant unhappiness. They decided to follow the brave example of the Pilgrims. The Puritans planned to go to America. They knew that life in the New World would be hard. They were willing to endure hardships. They wanted to be able to worship God as they thought right. The success of the Puritan colony owes a great deal to a wise leader, John Winthrop. John Winthrop deserves much credit for the planning, directing, and governing of the colonists leaving England. 11 ships set sail from England in the spring of 1630. The ships carried about 700 people. The journey was far more pleasant than the voyage was for the Pilgrims. The Puritans landed at the place which they called Salem. This colony later was called Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans made a better beginning than did the Pilgrims colony. The Puritans were wiser. They came to America in the spring. This group of settlers were not all poor people. Some of them were quite wealthy. They were able to bring horses, cows, goats, and hogs to America. They also were able to bring good farming tools, seeds, and cutting of fruit trees. These thoughtful Puritans did not neglect to bring fishing tackle. Rods, lines, hooks used to catch fish were often called fishing tackle. The supplies which Puritans brought were much better than and more plentiful than those of the poor Pilgrims were able to bring. The Puritans knew they would have to face long, cold winters. They would need good, warm houses. It would take too long for each settler to build his own home. So whenever a new house was built, all of the town helped. The work was done quickly and easily. Soon Massachusetts Bay Colony had many towns and villages. Puritan penalties. The Puritans came to America to be able to worship God as they thought right. Those who belonged to other religions were not allowed in the Puritan settlement. Only members of the Puritan church could come to the colony. Only members of the Puritan church had the right to vote. Severe penalties were inflicted on persons who were not members of the Puritan church. It was partly because of this that some of the Puritans left Massachusetts and started other colonies. Thank you. God bless. Goodbye.